Hello and welcome to How to Win, the Vandenberg Coalition series on the challenges facing the United States military and Department of Defense in an era of great power competition, heightened tensions, and increasing chaos around the world. Today, we're discussing how a future U.S. administration can ensure our military is adequately resourced and funded by the defense budget. We'll touch on modernization, investment, and where we can make cuts to ensure we can rise to the challenge. Here to discuss with me is Mackenzie Eaglen. Mackenzie is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she works on defense strategy, defense budgets, and military readiness. She currently serves on the U.S. Army College Board of Advisors, is a member of the congressionally established Commission on the Future of the Navy, and served as a staff member on the National Defense Strategy Commission, which produced the 2018 Providing for the Common Defense Report. Thank you for tuning in. Mackenzie, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
So let's start with a level set question. How would you characterize the current state of the United States' defense budget?
Well, it's a trick question, and I know you didn't mean it as one, but I do. Meaning, the inputs are important because it's a hugely expensive organization with an existential responsibility, right? It's to keep foreign threats at bay and Americans safe. And that costs a lot of money. It costs a lot of money to deter in peacetime and to win in wartime. So the tendency is to focus on the dollars, the inputs. I want to focus on the outputs of those investments, which is fraying. U.S. conventional military deterrence is fraying in Asia at the moment, and it's struggling to support two allies in two grinding wars in Europe and the Middle East.
So when we're thinking about the challenges the United States faces when it comes to adequately resourcing our budget, what are those that we face and how do we address them?
So the challenges are multifaceted. Some are external and many are internal, and some are, it depends on the culprit in Washington, which branch of government or stakeholder. But that's the thing. It's a giant organization, the largest federal agency by far, one of the biggest employers on the planet. And so a lot of people have their fingers in this pie. It's meaning there are many different stakeholders with sometimes competing incentives. So to address challenges in order to bolster conventional military deterrence and restore military strength would require tackling different levels of problems, from Capitol Hill to the Defense Department at the Pentagon to how the organization is run and managed, and civilian oversight and execution. Each one of these has, a thesis level solution set to them. But getting started, if I were walking in and I were thinking about how to handle this day one, the first thing I would do is be honest about the state of U.S. defenses and what's required to restore and rebuild and repair our fraying deterrent.
So, you mentioned restoring and rebuilding, and Peace Through Strength has been an incredibly important guiding post for a lot of us. Could you talk about our current defense spending in relation to what it has been previously?
Yes, absolutely. I was just at classic nerd Washington. I was just at Mount Vernon for Labor Day, and it was so much fun. And I kept trying to tell my kids, it's like, we all love Reagan and Peace Through Strength. It's great. But the original author of this concept was George Washington, of course, who said something to the effect of the surest means to avoid wars to be prepared for it, basically. But if you look at defense budgets in modern times, they're low at a time when we're using the military at an almost historic pace in all different kinds of places and bases all over the world for different reasons today. During the height of the Cold War, and particularly during the Reagan buildup, speaking of him again, we spent historic highs on defense, and Ronald Reagan used the military the least. There is a direct link between that proportional investment in peace, which did not keep itself, and a more calm and stable world, and using the military actually less. So right now we're hovering around 3% of economic output, gross domestic product. That's just one metric. You could look at this through percentage of federal spending, depending on the day. It's 12, 13, or 14% of total federal spending. And also in real terms, which the defense budget is falling, it's declining, it's not keeping up with inflation. So if you look at defense through pretty much any metric, it's in decline. And you can kind of see that again reflected. would argue, in the outputs of that investment.
So, that's kind of the state of what our current spending looks like and what our investment looks like. But I think it's also important to look at how our adversaries are investing in their defense. And you've done a lot of work in terms of exploring the Chinese defense budget. So could you tell us a little bit about the state of their defense budget and what the United States need to be doing to either match them or counter what they're doing?
So I think, Washington is lulled into complacent thinking because they hear this tired, outdated, and incorrect trope that the US spends more than the next X countries combined. Insert the number because it changes on a year-to-year basis, but 12, 10, 8. And if you study the Chinese defense budget, which we have thanks to AEI, and you've seen, and we don't take the Chinese Communist Party at its state media issued word for what they spend on defense, but we look at the actual outputs of their investments. The globe's largest air force, the planet's largest army, the biggest blue water navy on the planet. It is not ours, but also rockets, sub-strategic missile forces. You're getting the trend lines here, right? They have outmatched us in mass years ago, almost across the board. Their budgets, as I calculate them, are significantly higher than the CCP claims. So it's about on par with ours, except they get more bang for the buck for a variety of reasons. One, China doesn't have to pay their people, as they don't have professionals. They can, force people into the military. The second reason they get more spending bang for their buck is also because while China has a blue water navy, for example, that can sail anywhere in the world, they really are only trying to compete regionally and push around their neighbors. And so by my calculations, they outspend our Indo-Pacific allies by 5-1 on their military, which is a pretty startling statistic. So basically outnumbering everybody. We have to play an away game with the United States military. So for us to help defend Taiwan, for example, or the Philippines, or pick another country, it's not only exorbitantly expensive to get there and sustain operations, but again, we have two other fronts and two other important regions of the world where we seek a balance of power. China doesn't have to worry about that. So they're spending, if you looked at it through that lens, they're probably spending twice as much as we are on their military.
And so, it matters how much we spend, but it also matters how we're then spending the money. So you've talked about the importance of a procurement budget. Could you tell us a little bit about what that means and why it's important?
So how can China generate that level of combat power? It's because most of their defense dollars, counted and uncounted, are on military capability. If you look at our defense budget, back to my point earlier about all the different stakeholders and incentives within the budget and how the money is spent and within the organization more broadly, it's become a bureaucracy with many barnacles attached to it that have calcified over time. So there's a lot of spending within our defense budget that does not generate combat power. It is important. I'm glad somebody's spending it, but it's probably better suited to another federal agency or outside organization. So to give you an example, at AEI, our calculations are that it's about $110 billion within the defense budget. This doesn't generate core capabilities. But don't take our word for it. Anthony Brown, he's a former congressman from Maryland, and he put out an op-ed a couple of years I love to trot out, where he said $200 billion of the defense budget buys things that have nothing to do with U.S. military capability. And it's everything from entitlement spending to things like Medicare offset dollars to food stamps to other things. And that China doesn't have to worry about those kinds of investments creeping into their defense budget.
Sure. And so when you think about that and all the barnacles that are attached to this type of spending, I think that sort of makes the Defense Department a target, especially when you look at such a large top line. And a lot of times that puts fiscal hawks and defense hawks in opposition to one another. And a lot of fiscal conservatives propose, large cuts to the defense budget. So could you talk a little bit about why this is potentially misguided, and how members of Congress can articulate to their constituency that, a strong economy is important and spending wisely is important, but so is the defense budget and how they are complementary?
Absolutely. The cheapest wars are the ones you don't have to fight. So you can pinch a penny to save it now for peacetime deterrence and preventing bad things from happening. But if you do that and you wind up in conflicts you have not chosen or prepared for, the costs are astronomical to the national treasury, to American taxpayers, to American families, blood and treasure, to the wounded and the aftermaths of war. I mean, just the consequences are extraordinary. So to maintain a large standing army in peacetime, nobody wants to pay the insurance on their house to prevent the flood or fire, but when it comes, everybody is glad that they have it. That's the similar, kind of concept we're talking about here. So those, who say that they want to this is not just one other mouth to feed at the federal trough, I guess is basically what I'm saying. This is the only mandatory job of the federal government. The states and cities of America can't take on this responsibility to use violence in the name of the state. Only the feds can do that. It's exclusive and mandatory, the job of the federal government as laid out by our founding fathers. The costs really can't be passed to any others. Secondly, within the defense budget, the majority of the dollars just pay professionals. They're just like any other large organization in America. The biggest item on the balance sheet is people. So when you start hacking away the defense budget, you're going to take away jobs in your own state or district, but two, that's the same force that you're going to need to call upon, probably because you cut it too small, that you're probably going to wind up having to use it more.
Right. So at the same time, there are places where there are places to find savings and make reinvestments. And the 2024 National Defense Strategy Report came out with some suggestions, including reviewing all major weapon systems and comparing them with needs and empowering OSD to cancel programs. So how do we ensure that these recommendations are executed well and effectively?
It's important to find capable, honest brokers to adjudicate those kinds of decisions, but also people with a mind for recent history. Congress and the Pentagon have been slashing weapon systems for 15 years. It's one of the reasons the force is so small, frail, fragile, and unready. I love the next generation technology. We need the future cutting edge, game changing capabilities. We also need a whole lot of kit stuff to fly, sail, and drive in to accomplish the mission, to pair with new technology. Each year, though, consistently, in and out, Congress, Washington will retire more ships than are being built. Same thing with aircraft. Hundreds more retired than are being purchased new. Nothing is replaced on a one-to-one basis. So the force is left further unready, and then you see that sort of death spiral take place. So while I'm all for reform, I don't start with weapon systems because the troops need something. And that something has been going away for 15 years. That's been the favorite pot within the defense budget to raid. There are many other areas of the defense budget that are unscrutinized, that don't get the same level of attention from policymakers, because it's hard. It's a lot harder to look at military healthcare and outcomes than it is to just say we're going to kill this or that weapon system that someone in the field probably needed in the first place.
Right, and occasionally canceling certain programs can result in increased costs for the taxpayer. So could you tell us a little bit about how that could be avoided and what potential cost-saving reforms come from ensuring that we don't cancel certain weapon systems?
Right. So, if something is canceled early, the government owes the contractor who's doing the work that we've asked them to do money. So I think back to Robert Gates in 2010, it was this historic generation of modernization wiped out overnight. And in one example, the Marine Corps Expeditionary Fighting Depot, it was 95% complete. That is exactly the wrong program that you canceled. Just get it out there, get it in the field, fix it later, upgrade it, make it better. But this was just, like I said, it was just an easy target. It wasn't necessarily because it was strategic or right or wrong, or in other cases there were things that could be improved, and maybe you want to start over. Then there are different systems where the executive and the legislative branches, because they say don't want to pay for competition to have two different companies or vendors competing for something. So then there's one company and we don't buy as many as we say we are. And so then the costs go up because it's not like going to Costco where you're buying in bulk or at scale. The Defense Department hasn't really bought at scale also in 2 decades. And so when you start to buy really niche capabilities in small quantities, it's going to be a lot more expensive. It's just like any of us in our own lives. If we want the artisan cheese, it's going to be different than if you just go to your local grocery store and get any old cheese and cracker of your choice. Poor analogy, but you get the idea. And so these are just some examples of kind of principles and philosophies you want to bring towards examining capabilities and what to keep and what to give away. But I can tell you that the divest to invest concept that is prevalent in this administration, which is really just another word for ideas that were used in the previous 2 administrations as well. Like I said, in some cases it has merit, but in other cases it's really just created a smaller, more brittle force.
Sure. And so, you mentioned you have all of these sort of easy targets, but then on the other hand, you have a bunch of sacred cows that can't be touched. So how do we go about, reviewing and looking at those pet projects and making sure that we're spending well and wisely?
Yes, defense reform is the patient work of a leader and takes many years. There's no line item for broad waste and abuse or bad incentives or poor acquisition purchasing. I wish there was. But often to get at the more entrenched spending that needs to be freed up for, frankly, more investment in procurement, not less, that requires building new coalitions, not just between parties, but with stakeholders in and outside of the military. For example, with retirees, with veterans communities, and others. New coalitions, new advocates, basic education and awareness of where defense dollars just, on a general level go, as we've been talking about here on this podcast. And then also, just a fundamental understanding of the 2 contracts we have with those in uniform. I think too often we focus on what is the inherent, we might not talk about it, but in our gut, we understand that if we send people, that if people are going to go into harm's way, it's our duty to take care of them for life. And that is a good thing. That's why you would inspire someone to take on a job that's inherently risky and challenging. We have a second contract, I would argue, with those in uniform and their families, which is if you go into combat or war, it shouldn't be a fair fight. Both contracts need to be funded fully, and we focus too much on the first at the expense of the second.
Right. And, I think that problem, expands not just in terms of procurement, but into places like modernization as well. You wrote a report about the 2020s tri-service modernization crunch, where you break down the difficulties in budgeting in the 2020s because you have all these bills that are coming for the services. And it's all happening at one time. So is this something that could have been avoided, and how can a future administration potentially ensure that this doesn't happen and that we don't continue to keep running into this issue?
Yes, the terrible 20s, they are here. And what that is exactly how you described it. It's a rolling decade where wholesale modernization of our conventional and nuclear deterrents the bills are coming due at the same time, roughly the same time in this decade. And there's not enough money to do it all. It's totally foreseeable and avoidable. And everybody wanted the music to stop when they left the job or they weren't chairman of the committee anymore. And I get that. It's hugely expensive. But all of this has been, foreseen for 15 years. Part of it is because of the Reagan buildup, things are aging out at about the same time. That's okay. Nothing wrong with that, but then you need to replace them. But the other challenge is when you haven't done something in a long time, take, for example, nuclear missile ground-based missile modernization. We haven't done that work as a government in 60, 70 years. Those people aren't around anymore. The brain power, the scientists, the designers, the engineers, and everybody else in between. You have to recreate that. That doubly expensive, takes longer, it costs more. And then it continues to push and crowd out the other things that were next on the list because we didn't see that coming either. So I would argue that now that we're here, okay, I wish we could have avoided the challenge and just spent more in procurement leading up to this moment, but we didn't. Now that we're here, the instinct will be to fund nuclear modernization first, and then consecutively hope the funds are there for conventional modernization when we really have to get started we have to pull forward conventional modernization en masse at scale across the services and domains. I fear Washington will want to raid conventional modernization. So, starting to do things like cut submarine production or bomber procurement, things that are totally essential to the fighting forces and what they need. That debate is kind of at hand right now, and we're seeing it play out. And a year from now, when we do our next podcast, I'll let you know what Washington has chosen. But like I said, you can choose to save a penny now, but you will spend $50 equivalent of that later if you don't make the investment when it's time.
Right. And, we touched on this a bit earlier, but there's that concern of there are all these modernization programs, but then the weapon systems aren't ended up being fielded. So how does making changes before completing the designs of the capabilities, what does that mean for cost?
It depends on which capability we're talking about. What I've actually seen is the opposite. The government say, hey, we've got this military, they need this capability, somebody provide that. Somebody comes back and says, here's the capability, and it's mostly commercial, but we're going to make it a military useful application. And the government negotiates, and then once it's in hand says, you know what, we're going to need to change this pretty extensively, give us a couple of years. And then the thing that comes out looks nothing like the thing that came in. And so of course the cost change. There's no better poster child example of terrible management of a program than the US Navy's new frigate. So the whole point of the frigate was to get holes in the water as quickly as possible. So you use a foreign vessel design. 85% commonality. The Navy messed with it for a couple of years. GAO says it's now 15% common, and the program's probably going to sink, literally and figuratively. What a tragedy. The Navy is 275 ships on any given day, roughly speaking, and China's, well, depending on which Navy we're counting, is approaching 400 ships. This is the kind of mismanagement that is totally unacceptable. Heads should roll, but I don't know that anybody's been fired for that yet.
So then, how does this winner-take-all structure affect competition?
Well, winner-take-all is a little different. So winner-take-all is when Washington doesn't want to pay for competition. Competition costs slightly more upfront, but then you get the benefit over the lifetime of a weapon system. Not just its development and production, but its sustainment by having multiple vendors compete to keep that thing flying, keep that hull sailing, keep the vehicle driving. So if you want, for example, a second engine for your Joint Strike Fighter, yes, it's going to cost a little bit more in the early years, potentially, but the vendors will think about that in their bids. And then over the lifetime of the fleet, like I said, you can recompete sustainment of that and avoid entire groundings of, for example, the Joint Strike Fighter, which have happened repeatedly because nobody wanted to invest in the second engine. So again, you saved a little money at the start, and now, and since not only has the program not saved money, but those who fly it, the Joint Strike Fighter is repeatedly grounded as a fleet for problems with engine issues and other failings. That is that's cost to readiness, that's cost to deterrence, that's cost to pilots who aren't getting their flying hours, and so on. And you can see the ripple effect of that. That's just one extreme example of winner take all. But you can see this with ships, other different ship classes and capabilities. I can give you more examples. But it just goes to show that, again, these sort of short-sighted yearly decisions to not pay for certain things up front, to cut a little here, trim a little there, not pay for competition over here. And in the end, you always pay more for all of it.
Right. So, zooming out a bit, Obviously, Congress holds the power of the purse, but the executive still plays a role in that they deliver a budget to Congress, and a lot of that budget shapes, messaging and highlights specific defense priorities. So, what should a future administration include or leave out that the Biden administration didn't do?
A new administration should start with that honest assessment of where we really are. So if you go back to the 2018 Trump defense strategy, it basically said that America's military was in decline and in a period of strategic atrophy. The trend lines, as you pointed out from the Defense Commission, they haven't gotten any better since then. And so it's a realistic and very honest assessment of where the armed forces stand in terms of readiness, ability, and deterrence. Then an honest discussion about the cost to rebuild. But before you rebuild, you have to repair. The frayed foundations from the Budget Control Act, followed by the most latest debt ceiling deal, which sent over budgets that didn't keep pace with inflation, further accelerate the trends of decline underneath the top line. And then focusing on core areas where changes can be made quickly, and that we have to turn things around, or we have to turn things around. So of course I'm thinking back to triad modernization. We talked about that a little bit already. Shipbuilding, it's too important to get wrong, and everyone's in a blame game right now, and I call it the doom loop for shipbuilding. And things aren't turning around, but it has to. Where's the next John Lehman, in the 600 ship Navy plan? And then focus on the areas of strength. It's not all bad news. I don't want it to always sound like it is. The Space Force, other capabilities that are emergent, the new non-traditional companies that have come into the defense space that are providing truly remarkable capability in record time. Folding those in to this sort of future where we have a military where it's going to be humans and machines constantly operating together. Using those areas of strength and trying to hold the line on deterrence until we can repair and then rebuild, that would be where I would start.
Well, a future administration is really going to have their work cut out for them, but this isn't the first time that an administration has come in and revitalized the defense budget and made sure the military was adequately resourced. And so that should provide at least some hope. But with so much on the table, if you were to pick one priority that you think would be necessary to fund and focus on, what would it be?
Depending on what is the most critical challenge. And I think that, that's tough because between Putin, Israel, Hamas, and a potential new war, not new front, new war with Lebanon, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, total deterioration of freedom of navigation, and the U.S. Navy's role in trying to restore that in the Red Sea, and all that's happening in the Western Pacific, it's hard to pick which threat, that if you had to rank them, is the alligator closest to the boat.
Right.
I don't envy those who have to do it. However, knowing that those are the top challenges of the day, knowing that we're doing, I think, the best we can to support Europe, Israel, and like I said, to keep the Red Sea open. Does the Chinese Communist Party worry about one of the U.S. military's operational goals to perhaps sink their fleet of ships in 72 hours? And if that is a goal, then that directs me to the priority investments. If that's something that would actually change their viewpoint, actually be deterrence in action, then I would want to invest significantly more. I mean, double or triple, and particularly in munitions, bombs, missiles, rockets, but primarily precision missiles. And then ships. And maybe to some extent bombers. Those would be, for example, my 3 priority areas. If Mackenzie was like king for the day, but that's just one problem set. And maybe, when the new administration comes into office, unfortunately, there might be worse problems. But
well, hopefully not. And we appreciate these marching orders you've given us on how to win. And Mackenzie, as always, it has been absolutely wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
if not depressing, but yes, I'm gonna keep a positive outlook like you. So
always good to give it to us straight, right? Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.